It began as a proposal whispered through the corridors of the Pentagon, an idea so audacious that even seasoned officers thought it bordered on science fiction. In the twilight years of the Cold War, when the world seemed balanced on a trigger, American strategists sought a way to keep their nuclear arsenal alive after the first flash of war. Across the wide plains and endless rails of the continental United States, they saw an unlikely sanctuary, the humble freight train. If the nation's most destructive weapons could travel hidden among boxcars of coal, timber, and grain, then perhaps no enemy could ever find them in time to strike first. By the mid-1980s, every American missile silo was already mapped by Soviet reconnaissance satellites. Their orbits passed with mechanical precision, photographing each field of concrete lids that dotted Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. The logic was chillingly clear. Once nuclear war began, those fixed sites would be vaporized within minutes, leaving the United States unable to respond. The solution, planners argued, was movement. Mobility meant survival. And nothing in America moved with more quiet regularity than its railroads. More than 200,000 miles of track laced the nation together. A missile train could vanish into that steel labyrinth, indistinguishable from the millions of tons of cargo that rumbled through the heartland each day. The concept became known as the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison Program, a phrase chosen carefully to sound defensive, almost peaceful. But its purpose was anything but gentle. Each train would carry two LGM-118A Peacekeeper missiles, each one a 10-warhead giant capable of erasing entire regions of the Soviet Union. 12 trains, moving constantly and unpredictably, could deliver more firepower than all the bombs dropped in the Second World War. Yet to any passerby they would appear utterly ordinary, a string of grey boxcars, diesel fumes drifting in the cold air, wheels clattering softly over the rails. Designing such a machine demanded both ingenuity and secrecy. Engineers at Hill Air Force Base and Boeing's Defense Division began drawing blueprints for 12-axle launch cars strong enough to bear a 200,000-pound missile and the hydraulic system needed to raise it upright through the roof. Inside the command cars, compact living quarters, encrypted radios, and shock-mounted consoles would allow a crew to survive weeks on patrol. Outside, every detail was designed to deceive, from the paint color to the rust patterns copied from real freight equipment. The ideal deterrent, officials said, was the one no enemy could distinguish from the ordinary. To maintain the illusion, upgrades spread quietly across the national rail network. Bridges were reinforced, sidings extended, tunnels remeasured, all justified as routine freight improvements. Local contractors never suspected that they were preparing the infrastructure for nuclear war. Even many Air Force personnel were told only that they were supporting strategic mobility tests. The fewer who knew, the safer the secret remained. Still, unease shadowed the project. Critics feared a derailment or a collision could scatter nuclear material across the countryside. Others worried that hiding weapons among civilian trains blurred the line between military and public life. But proponents insisted that the risk was worth it. If deterrents failed and missiles began to fly, these trains would disperse across the rails like ghosts, launching from hidden clearings or industrial yards before the enemy even knew where to look. By 1987, prototype cars were rolling under tarpaulins on fenced test tracks in Utah and Wyoming. Photographs from the period show little more than dull metal rectangles baking under desert sun, faceless, anonymous, deliberately forgettable. Beneath that plain surface, however, lay the power to end civilization. To those who conceived it, the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison was the ultimate expression of Cold War logic, to preserve peace by mastering concealment, to guarantee survival through deception. In time, the world would forget these ghostly trains. But for a brief moment, America truly planned to hide Armageddon inside its railcars and let it ride quietly through the heart of the nation. Long before the first missile ever rode the rails, America's nuclear strength was rooted in concrete. From the 1960s onward, hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles lay entombed beneath the prairies of the Midwest, vast underground fortresses guarded by steel blast doors and men who waited for orders they hoped would never come. These silos represented the nation's ultimate insurance policy, the promise of retaliation that made a nuclear first strike unthinkable. For 2 decades, they worked exactly as intended. But by the dawn of the 1980s, the illusion of invulnerability began to crumble. The change came not from a weapon, but from an eye in the sky. Soviet satellites, equipped with high-resolution cameras and infrared sensors, could now photograph every launch complex with chilling precision. Their orbits passed over the Great Plains twice a day, recording the shape of every access road, the movement of every truck, even the pattern of snow melt over silo lids. What had once been hidden by distance was now visible from orbit. In war, that visibility meant death. American commanders realized that if a nuclear exchange ever began, the Soviet Union could destroy nearly all fixed missile fields before a single launch key turned. This vulnerability gnawed at the Pentagon's planners. They had spent billions fortifying underground silos against blast and heat, only to find that location, not strength, was their undoing. A missile that cannot move, one analyst wrote, is a target that cannot hide. The logic was merciless. Deterrence only worked if the enemy believed you could strike back. Once that belief faded, so did stability. Every new satellite photograph increased the temptation for a first strike. If one side could eliminate the other's arsenal in minutes, the balance of terror, the uneasy peace that had kept the Cold War cold, might vanish overnight. To counter the threat, the United States explored every imaginable alternative. Some proposed burying missiles in deep tunnels that could eject mobile launchers to the surface. Others envisioned fleets of tractor-trailers roaming backroads under cover of darkness. The Navy argued for expanding submarine patrols beneath the polar ice, while the Air Force pushed for airborne command centers that could direct launches even after Washington was gone. Each idea promised survivability, but at a cost measured in billions. Congress demanded something both cheaper and less provocative, or a weapon that could disappear without rewriting the nation's infrastructure. It was within this climate of anxiety and competition that the rail concept emerged. Railroad mobility offered everything the military craved: speed, unpredictability, and a cloak of ordinariness. The existing network already spanned the continent, crossing deserts, forests, and mountains. No new silos, no new bases, just a new use for something Americans already trusted. Trains had always been symbols of connection and progress. Now they would serve as the arteries of deterrence, carrying the means of survival through the veins of the nation itself. Still, the idea unsettled many within the defense community. Moving nuclear weapons through civilian landscapes invited nightmares of accidents, hijackings, and miscommunication. Yet every strategic simulation reached the same conclusion: fixed silos were dying relics of an older age. To survive in a world of constant surveillance, America's deterrent had to move, to blend, to vanish. The era of the immovable fortress was ending, and the era of the invisible arsenal was about to begin. As the decade turned and the arms race accelerated, the decision was made. The Air Force would develop a weapon that could live on the rails, a missile system designed to look like nothing at all. It was a quiet revolution in the logic of nuclear war, and it would soon transform the very idea of how a superpower prepared for the end of the world. The idea of putting nuclear weapons on trains had existed since the dawn of the missile age, whispered occasionally in think tanks and strategy papers, but never taken seriously. In the 1960s, a few early experiments proved that mobility could protect deterrents, yet the technology to make it reliable simply didn't exist. The railways belonged to another century, gritty, mechanical, prone to derailments and accidents. No one wanted to trust Armageddon to locomotives. But by the 1980s, technology had changed, and so had the fear. Computers, solid-fuel rockets, and satellite navigation transformed what was once fantasy into a credible plan. The Air Force called it the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison, and it would become one of the most secret and ambitious defense programs of the late Cold War. The concept took shape inside the Strategic Air Command, a force built on routine and readiness. Every day, missile crews sat underground in reinforced capsules, rehearsing the same launch procedures over and over, their fingers inches from keys that could erase cities. Yet those same crews knew their locations were marked on Soviet maps with pinpoint accuracy. It was a game of fatal transparency. The rail garrison offered something thrillingly unpredictable, a missile force that could be anywhere, seen by no one, able to vanish between the endless freight lines of the American interior. In early planning sessions, Air Force engineers and defense contractors gathered in windowless rooms filled with scale models and rail schematics. They studied weight limits, bridge tolerances, and track curvature, searching for ways to move an ICBM that weighed nearly 200,000 pounds without revealing its presence. Each missile would require its own launch car and a massive, 12-axle platform fitted with hydraulic pistons, shock absorbers, and sliding roof panels. When ordered to fire, the train would stop, raise the missile vertically through a hatch, and launch it straight from the rails. Minutes later, it could move again, leaving nothing behind but a scorched patch of gravel. From the outside, however, these trains would look deliberately mundane. Their cars would carry false markings from ordinary freight companies. Their paint would be weathered, their bolts streaked with rust, their surfaces scuffed with oil. Even the wheel patterns would mimic commercial stock to avoid detection from infrared sensors. If it stands out, one engineer warned, it fails. The perfect disguise was anonymity. Each train would be indistinguishable from the thousands already crossing the nation's rails, except for the 2 missiles slumbering inside. At Hill Air Force Base in Utah, fabrication began under intense secrecy. Workers with the right clearance assembled components inside hangars sealed from the public eye. Every piece was labeled under benign project names like Mobile Logistics Study or Transportation Module Test. Only a handful of senior officers understood that the entire system was designed to carry nuclear warheads capable of destroying a continent. Even the logistics of fuel and maintenance were concealed behind civilian contracts to mask their true purpose. The fewer people who knew, the longer the illusion could survive. By 1986, the first full-scale mock-up was ready. A prototype train, complete with locomotives, launch cars, and command units, was quietly tested on closed sections of track in the western deserts. To any observer, it was nothing remarkable, just another government freight convoy rolling through the dust. Yet inside, the future of deterrence was humming in steel and silence. Data gathered from those tests confirmed what planners hoped: the system could work. It could move. It could hide. For a brief moment, optimism swept through the Strategic Air Command. The United States, they believed, had finally found the perfect answer to the vulnerability of its silos. A weapon that could travel anywhere, look like anything, and strike from everywhere. It was elegant, logical, and terrifying all at once, a rolling fortress built not to fight, but to disappear. In the quiet confidence of those early years, few could imagine how quickly the world was about to change, and how soon this secret army of trains would find itself without a war to fight. Turning the rail garrison from concept into reality required engineers to solve problems that sat at the edge of practicality and patriotism, blending railroad mechanics with weapons engineering in ways the world had never seen. The Peacekeeper missile was not a delicate instrument you could tuck into a crate. It was a 200,000-pound column of solid-fuel rocket, guidance systems, and warheads that demanded precise support and shock isolation. Normal freight cars flexed, buckled, and kissed the rail joints in ways that would have shredded delicate avionics and guidance assemblies, so every aspect of the launch car had to be reimagined from wheel to roof. Designers began with the running gear, rather than the common 4-axle trucks beneath most boxcars. The launch platform required 12 axles distributed across articulated bogies to spread the load and reduce per-axle pressure on bridges and track. Massive dampers and hydraulic isolators were specified to absorb vibration and sudden impacts, and redundant braking systems were integrated to hold a ship of steel and rocket steady when the missile rose. Beneath the anonymous steel shell, a mechanical ballet was choreographed with industrial precision. At launch, hydraulic rams would unfold, lifting the missile from its horizontal cradle through a sealed hatch in the roof, where a telescoping launch ring would stabilize the canister upright and prepare the motor ignition system. Engineers designed the roof hatch to remain flush with the car's profile during transit, employing weather seals and heat-resistant panels so that infrared surveillance would read the car as inert freight. The launch sequence itself had to tolerate the roughness of rail operations. Control systems were shock-mounted and hardened against electromagnetic pulses, while fail-safes ensured that a single electrical fault could neither raise nor fire the weapon. Living systems for the crew, air filtration, climate control, water recycling, and food stowage were compacted into adjacent command cars so that a small team could remain on patrol for extended periods without exposing the train to maintenance stops that might reveal its purpose. Communications posed another set of challenges. The rail network offers no guarantees of continuous line of sight to command authorities, and wartime electromagnetic environments can be chaotic, so the program invested heavily in secure, redundant links, satellite uplinks disguised as telemetry packages, burst transmissions timed to pass at scheduled windows, and hardened radio arrays masked within faux freight antennas. Command and control software was encrypted with multi-key protocols and paired with permissive action links that required multiple authenticated codes before any launch order could be executed. The architects of the system understood that survivability depended as much on command integrity as on physical concealment. If a train could be isolated but remained inert because its orders were compromised, deterrence would fail. Logistics also shaped the technical design. Fueling, maintenance, and security had to be accomplished without public alarm. Specialized support trains, again bearing civilian covers, carried maintenance crews, spare parts, and refueling equipment to meet the operational tempo. Siding lengths were standardized to permit rapid dispersal, bridge reinforcement plans and depot upgrades were mapped to accept the heavier loads without drawing attention. Even the paint and surface wear of the cars were engineered. Technicians studied the weathering patterns of commercial freight and intentionally replicated scratches, oil stains, and rust streaks so that thermal and visual reconnaissance would pass over them as indistinguishable from ordinary traffic. Yet for all the technical elegance, the program was haunted by the practical risks of mixing weapons and civilian infrastructure. A derailment in a populated area, a structural failure on an aging bridge, or a misrouted train could convert a deterrent into a catastrophe. Safety interlocks, environmental containment measures, and emergency response procedures were written into the manuals, but critics argued that no set of protocols could fully remove the hazard of placing nuclear ordnance amid the everyday flow of commerce. Proponents countered that immobility itself was a greater danger. A stationary silo is a fixed target, while a moving train, they said, is a ghost. By the late 1980s, prototype launch cars had demonstrated key principles under controlled conditions. The hydraulic lifts worked, shock isolation reduced vibration to acceptable levels, and encrypted command links could function from within heavy steel. Those successes, recorded in classified test reports and guarded briefings, convinced decision-makers that the engineering problems, though formidable, were soluble. What remained impossible to quantify was not a matter of metal or software, but of politics and public trust, the human variables that would ultimately determine whether a nation would quietly allow its rails to carry the capacity for annihilation. From the moment the Rail Garrison Program moved from blueprints to steel, its greatest challenge was no longer engineering, it was invisibility. The United States had built a machine designed to hide, but the Soviet Union was watching. By the mid-1980s, Moscow's intelligence apparatus had matured into one of the most comprehensive surveillance systems on Earth. Fleets of reconnaissance satellites circled the planet, electronic listening posts scanned radio frequencies, and analysts pored over every anomaly that appeared on their screens. To them, the American landscape was a vast chessboard, and the goal was simple: locate every possible launch site before a missile ever left the ground. Now, a new piece had entered play, one that could move unpredictably across millions of square miles. The very notion of mobile nuclear trains alarmed Soviet planners to their core. At first, Soviet analysts dismissed the rumors as propaganda, an impossible scheme born from American paranoia. But fragments of evidence soon trickled in. Satellite imagery showed new rail sidings appearing near Air Force facilities, tracks being reinforced in remote desert regions, and clusters of railcars parked under heavy security. Even to experienced photo interpreters, the scenes were ambiguous. A siding might serve a lumber yard or a missile train, and only context could tell the difference. The KGB's technical divisions launched a crash effort to catalog every U.S. rail modification that deviated from commercial patterns. Analysts cross-referenced shipping manifests, rail schedules, and satellite photos in search of the ghost trains they believed were hiding in plain sight. The Americans, aware of these eyes in the sky, responded with their own deception. Every genuine construction project was camouflaged by a dozen false ones. Civilian contractors were quietly encouraged to upgrade unrelated sections of rail to overload Soviet imagery analysts with noise. At the same time, the Air Force coordinated with intelligence agencies to manage the optical signature of its real test sites. Trains were moved under cover of night or under temporary structures designed to confuse thermal sensors. Even locomotive models were chosen with care, standard diesel engines that blended seamlessly with regional freight lines. In this silent duel of observation, every rivet, every plume of smoke, became an act of misdirection. For Moscow's engineers, the strategic implications were intolerable. A rail-based missile system would upend the delicate calculus of deterrence. If the Americans could disperse their nuclear arsenal onto the national rail grid, then the Soviet Union could never be certain how many missiles remained after a first strike. The advantage of surprise, upon which both superpowers had built their war plans, would evaporate. And so began a new phase of the intelligence race, tracking what could not be seen. Signals units in Vladivostok and Kaliningrad were tasked with monitoring the electromagnetic chatter of the U.S. heartland, while radar and thermal sensors aboard reconnaissance satellites sought patterns in the movement of heat signatures along remote rail corridors. But trains are restless creatures, and every pattern they discovered dissolved into ordinary commerce. Inside the Kremlin's defense committees, frustration turned to fear. Some generals urged the Politburo to pursue a parallel project, to build their own mobile missile trains under the RT-23 Molodets program. Others called for diplomatic pressure, demanding new arms control talks that would ban mobile ICBMs altogether. Yet secrecy proved difficult to regulate. Treaties could limit numbers, but not imagination. The very existence of the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison, even unproven, altered the psychological balance of the Cold War. It whispered a message both sides understood: your eyes cannot protect you anymore. For American commanders, Soviet attention was both proof of success and a source of anxiety. The program had achieved its purpose, the enemy was uncertain, but that uncertainty also raised the risk of miscalculation. If Moscow mistook a routine freight movement for a missile deployment, it might respond with heightened alert or even preemptive action. To mitigate that danger, U.S. officials wove layers of restraint into operational planning, strict communication protocols, redundant authentication checks, and limits on how often the trains could move during peacetime. In a confrontation measured by perceptions, discipline was as vital as secrecy. By the late 1980s, the contest had become one of patience rather than firepower. Soviet satellites continued to scan the American heartland, American intelligence continued to craft illusions for them to chase. Somewhere in the empty plains of Wyoming or the flat expanses of Kansas, anonymous trains still rumbled through the night, indistinguishable from the millions of others that kept the nation alive. Neither side knew which boxcar carried grain and which carried the end of the world. And that, for a time, was exactly how the United States wanted it. In the final years of the 1980s, the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison moved from blueprints and simulations into the harsh glare of real-world testing. The American desert became its proving ground, a vast, empty stage where steel and secrecy could coexist. At remote corners of Hill Air Force Base in Utah and F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, crews assembled the first operational prototypes, their work hidden behind barbed wire and the anonymity of official silence. For the men who built them, these tests were the most unusual duty of their careers, conducting the world's first rehearsal for nuclear war on rails. The trains themselves were ghosts, stripped of all identifying markings. Their boxcars wore the faded industrial gray of ordinary freight, but each one was a machine of precision, its walls lined with shock absorbers, coolant lines, and instrument panels disguised beneath layers of metal. Inside the command cars, air hummed through filters while oscilloscopes flickered in the dark. Crew members wore no insignia, and their orders were delivered in sealed envelopes. Each team trained to operate in isolation, sustaining itself for weeks at a time without contact with the outside world. The mission was simple but absolute: remain invisible, remain mobile, and be ready to launch at a moment's notice. Every exercise began the same way. Locomotives fired up under the pale dawn, diesel fumes rising into the cold air as the long, unmarked convoy crept out of its siding. The noise was ordinary, familiar, almost comforting, the clatter of steel wheels, the echo of horns across empty plains. No one watching from a distance would have suspected that inside those cars slept enough destructive power to level a nation. Each movement was carefully logged, every vibration recorded by sensors to test whether the missile's delicate guidance systems could endure the jostle of the rails. The trains rumbled through valleys, deserts, and mountain passes, simulating the routes they might one day use if war ever came. At designated checkpoints, the train stopped for drills that transformed routine into theater. Hydraulic lifts groaned as massive roof panels slid aside, revealing the cylindrical canisters of the Peacekeeper missiles rising into position. The crews operated with ritual precision, executing the launch sequence up to the final ignition step, never crossing the boundary between practice and apocalypse. Data streams poured into recording systems, confirming that the vehicles could, in theory, raise and fire their missiles within minutes of a launch order. Observers describe the sight as both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a freight car unfolding into an instrument of planetary destruction, then folding itself neatly back into the shape of ordinary commerce. Safety officials watched each demonstration with quiet dread. The potential for disaster was immense. One misfired hydraulic arm, one electrical fault, and millions of dollars in hardware could be destroyed. Yet every test ended without catastrophe, reinforcing the confidence of its designers. The system worked. It could move unseen, deploy unseen, and vanish again into the landscape. The Air Force began drafting plans for full deployment, a fleet of 25 trains, each carrying 2 missiles, patrolling constantly across the country's rail network. If approved, the United States would possess a second nuclear triad all its own, a deterrent that could never be pinned down. But the tests also revealed the immense strain such operations placed on men and machines. Crews reported fatigue, the psychological toll of isolation, and the eerie weight of secrecy. They could not tell their families where they went or what they did. Railroad personnel assigned to assist were bound by non-disclosure agreements and instructed to treat every mission as classified cargo. Even within the military, only a handful of officers had clearance to read the full operational orders. The trains were not just hidden from the Soviets, they were hidden from the nation that built them. Photographs from those tests still exist, grainy, sun-bleached images showing a string of grey boxcars parked amid desert scrub, the distant mountains shimmering in heat haze. To the untrained eye, it is nothing remarkable. To historians, it is the closest humanity ever came to putting a nuclear trigger on wheels. Within those empty stretches of rail, the United States rehearsed a war it hoped never to fight, proving that even in the most ordinary landscape, the machinery of annihilation could lie waiting, perfectly still beneath the desert sun. For a program designed to be invisible, the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison soon became surrounded by rumors. In towns scattered across the Midwest and the Mountain West, people began to whisper about strange military trains seen rolling through at odd hours, convoys that moved without listed cargo, guarded by armed men who never spoke. Some swore they saw missiles beneath the tarps, others claimed the cars hummed with electricity or bore strange serial numbers that didn't match any known railroad company. To local newspapers, it was the stuff of curiosity. To Washington, it was a liability. Every rumor threatened to expose a project meant to exist only on paper. Accidents, both real and imagined, added fuel to the speculation. In one widely circulated story from Wyoming, a freight consist derailed in a remote valley after a brake failure. Witnesses reported military trucks arriving within hours, sealing the site and hauling away the wreckage under heavy guard. The official report called it a routine recovery of classified equipment, but locals believed they had glimpsed one of the secret missile trains. Another tale came from Utah, where a section of newly laid track was torn up overnight and replaced by crews who refused to answer questions. Nothing was confirmed, and perhaps nothing happened at all. Yet in the fevered imagination of the Cold War, absence of evidence was proof enough. Inside the Air Force, these stories caused quiet panic. The project's success depended on anonymity. Even the hint of a leak could compromise the illusion. To counter the growing folklore, officials deliberately fed the public misleading information, attributing mysterious rail activity to ordinary defense shipments or research logistics. They even coordinated with civilian rail companies to issue false manifests that blurred the lines between real freight and classified cargo. The strategy worked, at least for a while. But secrecy has its own gravitational pull. The more the government denied, the more the rumors grew. By 1989, conspiracy magazines and late-night radio programs had turned the nuclear ghost trains into modern legend, complete with sketches and supposed eyewitness accounts. Beneath the myth, though, genuine danger lingered. Moving nuclear-capable missiles across thousands of miles of public rail presented endless opportunities for error. A signal failure, a misaligned switch, even a minor collision could end in catastrophe. Engineers designed the cars to withstand impacts and fires, but safety inspectors admitted privately that no amount of armor could erase all risk. The trains traveled through populated areas, across rivers, and under city bridges. One wrong turn, one faulty signal, and Armageddon would be parked beside a commuter platform. It was a scenario so unthinkable that officials refused to put it in writing. The secrecy also took a toll on the men assigned to operate the trains. Crews lived in isolation, bound by silence, aware that one careless word could end their careers, or worse. Many spoke later of the haunting loneliness of the job, endless horizons, nights spent rolling through empty plains, the weight of a weapon powerful enough to erase civilization only a few feet away. Every mechanical rattle or spark became a reminder of what they carried. Psychologists at Strategic Air Command headquarters quietly monitored the teams, noting fatigue, insomnia, and anxiety. The strain was invisible but real. Meanwhile, activists and journalists began to circle. Environmental groups demanded answers about the safety of transporting nuclear weapons through their states. A handful of senators questioned the wisdom of hiding missiles among civilian freight. The Air Force responded with silence or vague reassurances about strategic mobility. Yet even within the halls of government, doubt had begun to spread. The Cold War was changing. Mikhail Gorbachev was speaking of reform and disarmament, and treaties were beginning to limit the nuclear stockpiles of both superpowers. In that new climate, a fleet of secret missile trains began to look less like a deterrent and more like a relic of paranoia. Still, the image endured, long, grey trains rolling through the night, their cargo unknown, their purpose unspoken. To the public, they were legend. To the Air Force, they were contingency. And to history, they would become one of the strangest symbols of an era when fear and imagination shared the same set of tracks. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison was nearing the threshold of full deployment. Prototype trains had proven their reliability, test launches had validated the hydraulics and guidance systems, and Strategic Air Command officers had refined their patrol procedures. On paper, the system was ready. But the world outside the hangars and test tracks was no longer the same one that had conceived it. The Cold War, the invisible storm that had driven every decision for half a century, was beginning to dissolve, and with it went the reason for the train's existence. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. What began as an act of defiance in East Germany quickly cascaded into a geopolitical landslide. Communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe, Soviet influence fractured, and within 2 years, the Union itself began to disintegrate. The enemy that had justified decades of nuclear preparation was vanishing before America's eyes. Inside the Pentagon, excitement turned to confusion. How do you fund a weapon built to deter a foe that no longer seemed capable of attack? Congress, sensing an opportunity to reclaim billions from the defense budget, began asking pointed questions. Lawmakers who once approved funding with silent nods now demanded transparency, audits, and justification. The numbers were brutal. Each rail garrison train would cost hundreds of millions to build and maintain. The total program expense approached $7 billion. For a peace that suddenly seemed permanent, the price felt obscene. Environmental and public safety concerns followed close behind. Advocacy groups argued that moving nuclear missiles through populated areas violated both common sense and moral responsibility. They cited the risk of accidents, contamination, and human error. The Air Force countered with studies showing redundant safety systems and near-zero accident probabilities, but political momentum had shifted. The image of atomic weapons rolling past farms and towns was simply too powerful for reassurance to erase. What had once been seen as ingenious was now condemned as reckless. Even within the military, enthusiasm waned. Strategic Air Command officers privately admitted that rail patrols were logistically exhausting and politically fragile. The trains required constant coordination with civilian rail networks, which were undergoing their own economic struggles. Maintenance facilities had to be disguised as ordinary depots. And every movement required security sweeps across hundreds of miles of track. The glamour of mobility had given way to the grinding reality of complexity. In 1991, the final blow arrived not from Congress, but from diplomacy. The United States and the newly formed Russian Federation signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START-I, a sweeping agreement to reduce and limit strategic offensive weapons. Among its many clauses was a quiet line that effectively sealed the fate of the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison, restrictions on mobile ICBM deployment. Both nations agreed to cap or eliminate the systems that made preemptive strikes unpredictable. For Washington, continuing the rail project in secret risked accusations of treaty violation and diplomatic collapse. The choice was clear. The trains would not roll. By the end of that year, the program was formally cancelled. Some components were transferred to museums, others to scrap yards. A few prototype cars were mothballed in fenced desert lots, their paint fading under relentless sun. The crews were reassigned, their records sealed. Officially, the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison had been an experiment, an engineering study, nothing more. Unofficially, it had been a weapon waiting for a war that never came. For the engineers and officers who had poured years into the project, the cancellation felt both inevitable and hollow. They had built something extraordinary, something that worked, only to see it undone by the very peace it was meant to protect. Yet in a quiet sense, that was its success. The Cold War ended not in fire, but in exhaustion and understanding. The trains, those steel ghosts of deterrence, never left their sidings. And perhaps it was better that way. They had fulfilled their mission without ever moving. The mere idea of them had been enough to help keep the peace. When the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison was officially terminated, there was no ceremony, no televised dismantling, no triumphant declaration of peace. The trains simply disappeared into the silence they had been born from. The remaining prototypes, those massive, grey launch cars built with such precision and secrecy, were quietly moved to remote storage sites in the deserts of Utah and the plains of Wyoming. There they sat, sealed behind chain-link fences topped with razor wire, guarded not by soldiers but by neglect and time. To the casual passerby, they looked like obsolete freight equipment awaiting auction, relics of an industry long past. But inside those steel husks lingered the memory of a world balanced on the edge of annihilation. In the years that followed, a few photographs surfaced, grainy shots taken through fences by rail enthusiasts or retired Air Force workers. They showed vast, windowless boxcars with faded identification numbers, their sides streaked with rust, their wheels half buried in dust. The markings gave nothing away, yet those who knew what to look for recognized the unique 12-axle configuration, the heavy suspension designed to cradle a missile, the faint outline of the hydraulic hatch sealed on top. These images began to circulate on early internet forums devoted to Cold War mysteries, where amateur historians pieced together the remnants of the story. For many, it was the first tangible proof that the myth of the nuclear ghost trains had been real all along. At Air Force archives, declassified documents slowly began to trickle out under the Freedom of Information Act. Most were heavily redacted, pages of black ink where names and locations once stood, but even so, they revealed glimpses of a program that had come astonishingly close to full deployment. Memos described test successes, logistics reports detailed the challenges of coordinating with civilian rail companies, and engineering diagrams showed the ingenious mechanisms hidden within the launch cars. Together, they painted a portrait of a system that had worked perfectly, only to be defeated by timing and politics. Operational readiness achieved, one line read, dated just months before cancellation. Then, nothing. For the men and women who had designed the trains, the aftermath was bittersweet. Many never spoke publicly about their work, bound by classification even long after the project's demise. Some moved on to civilian rail engineering, others retired in quiet pride, knowing they had participated in one of the last great hidden chapters of the Cold War. When interviewed decades later, a former engineer described the program with a mixture of awe and melancholy. "We built something flawless," he said, "and hoped it would never be used. In that sense, it was the most successful failure of my career." As years turned into decades, the prototype cars remained where they were, weathering under sun and snow. Birds nested in the couplings, weeds crept up the sides, and paint flaked off in long, curling strips. Occasionally, a maintenance crew would visit to inspect or photograph them for historical documentation. No one seemed to know exactly what to do with the relics, too valuable to scrap, too secret to display. They became monuments to an era when imagination and fear had fused into technology. Nearby towns forgot they existed, even railroad workers who passed the storage yards daily ceased to notice them. The trains had finally achieved their purpose, they had vanished into the landscape, unseen and unremarked. Today, a few fragments of the program survive in museums, an undercarriage here, a section of armored plating there. Visitors walk past them, often unaware of their significance. To most, they're just curious artifacts of military engineering. But for those who understand what they once carried, they represent something profound, a moment when humanity tried to outsmart its own extinction, when survival was measured not in strength, but in concealment. The Peacekeeper Rail Garrison never launched a missile, never fired a shot, yet it remains a symbol of the Cold War's strange logic, when peace was preserved by machines that were never meant to move. The Peacekeeper Rail Garrison was never meant to be remembered. It was designed to exist in motion and in silence, to be both everywhere and nowhere, a weapon whose power lay not in its use but in its invisibility. Yet as the decades have passed, the trains that never rolled have come to symbolize the strange genius and deeper madness of the Cold War, an era when humanity spent its brightest minds and deepest fears to keep catastrophe at bay. In the logic of deterrence, survival was a paradox. To prevent destruction, one had to build the means to guarantee it. The rail garrison embodied that paradox perfectly, beautiful in its engineering, horrifying in its purpose. In retrospect, the idea seems almost mythical. Freight trains, icons of American industry and progress, transformed into instruments of apocalypse. Beneath their steel and soot, they carried a philosophy as much as a weapon, that safety could be found in motion, that invisibility could be peace. For the engineers who built them, the rail garrison was not a weapon of war but a form of insurance, an unspoken promise that deterrence would endure even in the chaos of a first strike. The missiles would live among the people, unseen but ready, ensuring that no adversary could ever believe the United States could be silenced with one blow. But history, as always, moves faster than machines. The Cold War ended without the trains ever leaving their sidings, yet the concept they represented never truly disappeared. In the decades that followed, nations continued to seek mobility as the key to survival. Russia resurrected its own version of the idea with the Bargusin Rail ICBM project, a modern echo of the very system America had abandoned. China explored mobile missile convoys capable of vanishing into the vastness of its interior. Even the United States revisited the notion in classified studies, this time imagining road mobile or containerized launch systems that could be hidden within the flow of global trade. The lesson of the rail garrison endured. In a world where everything can be seen, the only true defense is to become unfindable. Yet there is something haunting about that lesson. To hide one's weapons among the ordinary is to erase the line between peace and war, between civilian life and military preparation. The same tracks that carried grain, mail, and families across generations were once mapped as potential launch corridors for nuclear missiles. It is a reminder that even the most familiar landscapes can conceal the machinery of destruction, and that the boundary between safety and annihilation has always been thinner than we wish to believe. Standing today in the quiet storage yards where the prototypes rest, surrounded by rust, dust, and silence, one can almost hear the echo of what might have been, the low hum of diesel engines, the distant rhythm of wheels against rail, the unseen heartbeat of deterrent rolling through the night. These trains were never launched, never fired, never revealed to the public, and yet their existence shaped strategy, budgets, and fears across an entire decade. Their purpose was never destruction, it was uncertainty. As long as they might exist, no enemy could sleep easily. The Cold War has ended, but its shadow lingers in every system still built to deter rather than destroy. The logic remains the same, the weapons that move are the weapons that survive. And so the legacy of the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison endures, not as a relic of paranoia, but as a cautionary monument to the era when humanity's greatest defense was to hide its own power within the ordinary rhythm of life. In the end, the trains fulfilled their purpose without ever leaving the yard. They kept the peace not by running, but by reminding the world that peace itself is never stationary. Like the rails that cross a continent, it must always move forward, quietly, relentlessly, unseen.